I'm Captain Tori Myers, and I was 32 years old on the morning my mother asked me to hide the person I had become. She stood in the doorway of my childhood bedroom, holding a blue dress on a hanger, and quietly asked me not to wear my military uniform to my younger brother's wedding. "The military is embarrassing," she said. "Just this once. Wear this instead and blend in." I had traveled all the way home for that wedding. For years I had stayed silent, avoided arguments, and accepted my place in the family. But in that moment, standing in the hallway with my mother, something finally became clear. She had no idea who would be attending that wedding, or what they would think. To be honest, neither did I. What happened after I walked into that ballroom is something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where the people who are underestimated often turn out to be the strongest in the room. If you enjoy stories where quiet dignity speaks louder than revenge, make sure to leave a comment and subscribe, because this story will stay with you long after it's over. But before we get there, you need to understand who I was before that day. My apartment near the base is small enough that almost everything I own fits into a single duffel bag, and I prefer it that way. My boots stay by the front door, my coffee is always strong, and most evenings I'm asleep before 9. The Marines I served beside understood me better than my own family ever did. We shared meals from the same cans, stood the same watches, and when one of us struggled through a difficult night, the rest stayed awake together. That was the closest thing to a real family I'd ever known. My biological family was different. It always felt like a place where everyone spoke a language I never truly learned. I was the older sibling, the one who left home at 18 and never returned as the daughter they expected. I mailed birthday cards, attended funerals, carried the heavy boxes, and quietly handled whatever needed to be done without being asked. That had always been my role in the Myers family. Keep the peace. Carry the burden. Never make anyone uncomfortable. So when my mother called and invited me to Wes's wedding, I agreed before she even finished asking. I always said yes. I booked my flight, pressed my dress uniform out of habit, and convinced myself the trip would be easy. A wedding toast, a few dances, and then back home. Planning military operations had become second nature to me. Predicting my own family had never been. There's something about myself I've never completely understood. I can stay calm while lives depend on my decisions. I can give orders under pressure without hesitation. But put my mother in front of me with that familiar look of disappointment, and somehow I become half the person I know I am. That weekend I finally learned how much that habit had cost me. Being overlooked doesn't happen all at once. It happens quietly. Not through one painful moment, but through hundreds of small ones collected over years. When I enlisted, my mother told the neighbors I was simply taking some time to figure out my future. When I earned my commission, she skipped the ceremony because she had a charity luncheon she didn't want to miss. When I was promoted, she changed the subject and started talking about my cousin's newly remodeled kitchen. Eventually, I stopped sharing my achievements. Whenever I mentioned a deployment, her smile became stiff and uncomfortable. If I started talking about work, she'd suddenly find a reason to refill someone's iced tea or leave the conversation. One afternoon at a neighborhood barbecue, someone asked what I did for a living. Before I could answer, my mother smiled and replied for me. "Oh, Tori's in the service. Just a phase. She'll eventually settle into something more practical." More than once I overheard her telling my father in the kitchen that the military was embarrassing, never realizing that the air vents carried every word straight into my old bedroom. I heard those words when I was 24. Again at 28. By the time I turned 30, they no longer shocked me. They simply made me quieter. I'd already learned something important. You can't force someone to respect you by explaining yourself. So I became the daughter who mailed Mother's Day gifts, avoided talking about her career, and asked for nothing in return. And everyone in my family seemed perfectly comfortable with that arrangement. Not once, not my mother, not my father, not even my brother, ever asked what I actually did in the Marines. They had already decided who I was. And as long as I stayed inside that version of me, everyone was happy. The strange part is, for a long time I almost believed their version too. my younger brother, Wes, had always been the easy one to admire. It wasn't that he was more capable than I was. He simply fit the picture my family wanted. He graduated from a respected university, landed a successful job in finance, and carried himself with the confidence of someone whose future had always been mapped out. Around him, my mother practically glowed in a way she never had around me. When Wes called to tell us he was engaged, she cried for nearly an hour, but they were tears of pure happiness. His fiancée was named Sloane Whitfield, and the way my mother spoke her name, you'd think she belonged to royalty. The Whitfields came from old money, not flashy wealth, but the kind that had been passed down for generations. They had a respected family name, historic properties, and a reputation that opened doors without needing introductions. To my mother, Wes's engagement meant far more than a wedding. It meant our family had finally reached the social status she'd been chasing her entire life. "We're finally becoming the kind of family people respect," she told me over the phone. What stayed with me wasn't what she said. It was one word. Finally. As though the rest of us had been holding her back all these years. From that moment on, the wedding stopped being a celebration and became a carefully planned campaign. Every flower arrangement had to be perfect. Every meal had to impress. Every guest had to fit the image. And my role was simple. Show up. Mail. Stay unnoticed. I was already used to that part. What surprised me wasn't the wedding planning. It was Sloane herself. The first time we spoke on the phone, she didn't ask the usual polite questions. She wanted to know about my real life. She asked thoughtful questions about my work, listened carefully to every answer, and never once looked uncomfortable when I talked about serving in the Marines. By the end of the conversation, she smiled and said something I hadn't heard in years. "I'm really glad Wes has a sister like you." For a moment, I didn't even know how to respond. No one in my own family had said anything remotely like that in a very long time. Looking back, maybe I should have wondered then what kind of family had raised someone like Sloane. To be fair to my mother, and I truly try to be fair, you have to understand where her fears came from. Her father, my grandfather, returned home from Vietnam a completely different man. He struggled with trauma. He drank heavily. He couldn't keep a steady job. Our family moved constantly, always searching for cheaper places to live. My mother spent much of her childhood being the new girl in school, wearing clothes that didn't fit while trying to hide how poor they were. Once, during one of her rare honest conversations with me, she told me about a teacher who held up her worn-out shoes in front of the entire class. She was only 11 years old. She never forgot that humiliation. To her, my grandfather's military uniform wasn't a symbol of honor. It represented everything that had gone wrong. It reminded her of fear, instability, empty cupboards, sleepless nights, and a father who frightened her more often than comforted her. So she spent the rest of her life running from that past. She chased the right neighborhood, the right social circle, the right country club membership, even when she could barely afford it. Then her own daughter chose to wear the very uniform she had spent decades trying to escape. That's something stories like this rarely explain. My mother didn't truly hate me. She feared what I represented. Every medal on my uniform reminded her of the poverty and shame she'd fought so hard to leave behind. I understood that. I honestly did. But understanding someone's fear doesn't make their rejection hurt any less. Because when you're treated more like someone's painful reminder than their child, you spend your entire life being managed instead of loved. You're hidden, often kept out of sight whenever your presence threatens the image they've created. And no matter how long it goes on, there's always a small part of you that keeps hoping one day they'll finally choose you. I'd been waiting for that day longer than I realized. I just didn't know that the wedding weekend was about to force me to stop waiting. Everything changed 2 days before the ceremony. I was unpacking in my childhood bedroom when my mother knocked lightly on the door before walking in. She carried an elegant blue dress over one arm. Without saying much, she laid it carefully across my bed. "I thought this would look beautiful on you," she said. "It's your size." I looked at the dress. Then I looked at her. She couldn't quite meet my eyes. "The Whitfields are Very refined, she said carefully. The wedding is black tie. A military uniform might be a bit much. People will stare. I calmly told her I'd planned to wear my marine dress blues. Military officers wear them to weddings all the time. It's completely appropriate. She didn't even let me finish. She simply shook her head. Please, she said softly. Just wear the blue dress. For once. Blend in. There it was again. Not shouted. Not spoken with anger. Just quietly. Almost gently. Which somehow made it hurt even more. She wasn't asking me to change clothes. She was asking me to disappear. I stood there holding my dress uniform in one hand. And the blue dress in the other. Felt like I was weighing two different versions of myself. Immediately that old instinct returned. Keep the peace. Carry the burden. Don't make things uncomfortable. For a moment. Almost agreed. Actually almost said yes. Instead, I quietly told her I'd think about it. Relief immediately spread across her face. She squeezed my arm, smiled, and said she knew I'd understand. Then she walked downstairs to continue planning flowers, seating charts, and decorations. Leaving the blue dress behind on my bed. I sat beside it for a long time. I've carried equipment far heavier than any piece of clothing. But somehow, that dress felt heavier than anything I'd ever worn. Here's something I've never been proud to admit. I'm not someone who naturally fights back. That isn't humility. It's one of my greatest weaknesses. And over the years it has cost me more than I realized. The same discipline that helps you stay calm in combat can also teach you to stand silently while the people closest to you slowly erase who you are. You learn to absorb the pain. You learn to wait. Eventually, you convince yourself that your own discomfort is easier to carry than everyone else's. So you swallow it. A counselor on base once told me I suffered from what she called over-responsibility, the habit of carrying burdens that never truly belonged to me. She said it was something I could learn to let go of. I never figured out how. That evening, I sat alone on the floor of my childhood bedroom and reached inside the inner pocket of my dress uniform. There was one thing I never traveled without. Challenge coin. It wasn't fancy. Just a heavy metal coin with its edges worn smooth after years of rubbing against my thumb. A fellow Marine had given it to me years earlier, and since that day it had never left my pocket. Whenever I doubted myself, I held it. Whenever memories became too heavy, I turned it over in my hand until I remembered who I really was. I'm not ready to tell you the full story behind that coin just yet. But I can tell you this. Whatever my mother believed that uniform represented, it wasn't a phase. It wasn't a costume. It represented a morning I'll never forget. And people I'll never get to see again. I sat there holding the coin in one hand while the blue dress rested beside me. Then I reminded myself of something simple. You've walked into rooms far scarier than a ballroom. And it was true. I'd faced danger. I'd stood in places where every decision mattered. But there was one battle I'd never fought. Standing up to my own mother. Eventually I decided I'd make the choice in the morning. Sleep never really came that night. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Whitfield estate. It wasn't flashy or loud. It carried the quiet confidence that old family wealth often does. The walls were lined with portraits. A library stretched across one side of the house, complete with rolling ladders and shelves filled with books. Beyond the windows, the lawn sloped gently toward the water. Everything about the place felt timeless. My mother moved through the gathering as though she'd spent years imagining herself there. She laughed a little louder than usual, touched people's arms while speaking, introduced Wes proudly to almost everyone. As for me, I barely existed. Whenever someone asked about me, she answered before I could. "Oh, Tori's just between things right now," she'd say before quickly changing the subject. And like always, I let it happen. I found a quiet corner with a glass of water and watched everyone else enjoy the evening. At the time, two small moments caught my attention. Neither seemed important. The first was an old black and white photograph displayed on a side table. It showed a young Marine in uniform, strong posture, calm expression, eyes that carried a quiet determination I instantly recognized. The second was an elderly gentleman standing across the room. Silver hair, perfect posture. He looked directly at me for just a second longer than most people would. Then he gave the slightest nod before turning away. I assumed he was simply being polite. Still, something about that house felt strangely familiar. Couldn't explain why. I blamed it on nerves. The old wood. The smell of polished furniture. The pressure of the weekend. I ignored the feeling. Looking back, I wish I hadn't. I was so focused on making myself invisible that I completely missed the most important truth in that room. The Whitfields were nothing like my mother believed they were. By the time I discovered that, there would be no taking it back. Later that night, I returned to my room and unzipped my garment bag completely. The dress blues hung beneath the warm light of the bedside lamp. The dark coat, the high collar, the eagle, globe, and anchor shining from every polished button. The first time I'd ever worn that uniform, my hands had trembled. Not because I was afraid. 'Cause I understood its weight. Every detail had rules. Nothing on it was decorative. Every ribbon had been earned. Every medal had a story. Everything had its exact place. There was no room for pretending. That's what I loved most about it. A military uniform never lies. It quietly tells the truth about the person wearing it, whether anyone wants to hear that truth or not. I ran my fingers across the medals until they rested on the one place they always stopped. Across the room, the blue dress still hung neatly over the chair where my mother had left it. Elegant, beautiful, anonymous, the kind of dress someone wears when they don't want to stand out. I picked up the dress. Then I lifted my uniform, one in each hand, just like I'd done 2 nights earlier. That's when something finally became clear. When I imagined myself walking into the wedding wearing the blue dress, felt relief. But when I pictured myself walking in wearing my dress blues, felt fear. For the first time in years, I realized the fear mattered more. Because fear usually means you're standing close to something important. Without making a final decision, I carefully zipped the garment bag closed again and leaned it beside the bedroom door. I told myself there was still time. I was wrong. The very next morning, before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee, Wes found me standing in the kitchen. He carried 2 mugs. His expression told me immediately that he wanted something. He leaned against the counter and tried to sound casual. So, about the uniform. Waited. He rubbed the back of his neck before continuing. Look. The Whitfields are pretty formal. I just don't want it becoming, you know, a thing. It's my wedding day. I just want everything to go smoothly. Then he looked at me and quietly said the words that hurt most. Just be normal for one day. There it was again. The same message. Only dressed in different words. Be normal. As though I'd spent my entire life being anything else. I looked at my little brother. The boy I'd taught how to ride a bicycle. The man who had never once asked what I'd actually done during my deployments. And for the first time, that afternoon our family gathered for lunch. Around the table sat my aunts, uncles, cousins, and parents. At first, the conversation stayed light, moving from wedding plans to family gossip. Eventually, as it always seemed to, the attention shifted toward me. So, Tori, Aunt Carol asked with a pleasant smile, are you seeing anyone these days? I shook my head. No. She sighed softly, almost as if I'd delivered bad news. You know, she said gently. You're not getting any younger. Before I could answer, my uncle jumped in. I heard the military's cutting people these days, he said. Does that worry you? Another cousin leaned forward. Have you ever thought about getting a real career after you leave the Marines? Every question landed like another small stone. None of them sounded cruel on their own. But together, they became heavy. I smiled politely, passed the breadbasket, kept my voice calm, and let every comment settle without responding. Across the table, my mother watched it all with quiet satisfaction. These conversations fit perfectly into the version of me she'd spent years creating. The more they talked, the smaller I became, until I barely felt present at all. Only one person remained silent. My Aunt Diane. She sat at the far end of the table, hardly touching her food. Every few minutes she glanced at me, then at my mother, then back down at her plate. There was something troubled in her expression. More than once she looked as though she wanted to speak. Each time she stopped herself. Instead, she reached for her glass of water and stayed quiet. I noticed it, not because I understood it, but because silence like hers stands out when everyone else keeps talking. It felt like discovering a door slightly open inside an empty house. I didn't know what it meant. Not yet. But Aunt Diane clearly knew something the rest of us didn't. And whatever it was weighing heavily on her. 2 hours later, almost by accident, she would change everything. After lunch I went upstairs. I'm not proud of what I did next. I slipped on the blue dress. At least that's what I told myself. I claimed I only wanted to check whether it fit. That wasn't the truth. The truth was much harder to admit. I wanted to know whether disappearing might actually be easier than fighting. The dress fit perfectly. Of course it did. My mother had always known exactly what size I wore. I stood in front of the mirror in my childhood bedroom. The woman staring back at me looked beautiful, elegant, graceful, respectable, and completely unfamiliar. She had no sharp edges, no visible history. Nothing about her suggested courage, sacrifice, or service. She looked exactly like the woman everyone downstairs wanted me to become. Someone pleasant, someone forgettable, someone who didn't make anyone uncomfortable. Looking at that reflection hurt more than I expected. Because I'd spent years pretending to be her. I thought, maybe I could do it one more time. Wear the dress, smile through the speeches, board my flight the next morning, keep the peace. Just like I always had. No one would argue. No feelings would be hurt. Everyone would stay comfortable. I'd go home, slip my challenge coin back inside my uniform jacket, and remind myself that it didn't matter whether my family understood me. I'd been telling myself that same story for nearly 10 years. Only now did I realize what it had really become. An excuse. A way to avoid being brave in front of the only people whose opinions could still hurt me. I looked at myself again. Beautiful. Polite. Invisible. The decision was there. Just beyond reach. Dress. Or uniform. Disappear. Or finally be seen. Before I could decide, my phone vibrated on the dresser. It was a text from Aunt Diane. No message. Just a screenshot. Opened it. The moment I saw it, everything inside me shifted. But before I tell you what was in that screenshot, there's something you need to understand first. Challenge coin. Because both things collided in the same hour, and from that point on, I could never separate one from the other. The coin had belonged to Lance Corporal Danny Brennan. Danny was 19. He came from a tiny town in Ohio with only one traffic light. He always carried candy in his cargo pocket. Whenever someone was having a rough day, he'd quietly hand them a piece with that impossible grin of his. The week before everything changed, he placed that coin in my hand. "For luck, ma'am," he said. "You carry it." I laughed and tried to give it back. He refused. So I kept it. I still have it. He doesn't. Even now, 6 years later, I still struggle to say that part out loud. There was one morning, one road, one vehicle, a mission that should have ended differently. 3 Marines came home. Danny wasn't one of them. I've replayed those 90 seconds more times than I can count. Eventually, you stop searching for answers, not because the pain disappears, but because you realize it never will. The coin became the way I carried him with me. Every day. Close to my heart. So when my mother called the military embarrassing, she wasn't insulting a career. Without realizing it, She was insulting Danny. She was dismissing the worst day of my life. I closed my hand tightly around that coin. Then I looked back at my phone. And finally read Aunt Diane's screenshot. Everything changed. The image showed a family group chat. Its title read, Wedding Logistics. Everyone was included. My parents, my aunts, my cousins, everyone. Except me. Aunt Diane had quietly forwarded it only to me. Without adding a single word. Sometimes the truth doesn't need an explanation. It simply needs to be handed over. I read the messages once. Then again. Then a third time. My mother's words were impossible to misunderstand. Please make sure no one encourages Tori to wear her military uniform. The Whitfields are extremely refined. It would be humiliating. Seat her at table 9 near the back. Then came the sentence I will never forget. The military is embarrassing, and I'm not letting her turn Wes's wedding into a parade. Underneath it, someone had reacted with a thumbs up. One cousin replied, "LOL, agreed." Wes answered with only one word. "Fine." My father said nothing at all. I sat on the edge of my childhood bed. Still wearing the blue dress. Reading those messages over and over. Strangely, I didn't cry. I didn't panic. Became completely still. The same kind of stillness that settles over you when something serious is happening and emotions have to wait. There is a calm that doesn't come from peace. Comes from certainty. I gently placed my phone beside me. The screen still glowing with my mother's words. Table 9. Near the back. Don't let her become a parade. I finally understood something I'd spent 10 years refusing to see. My place in this family had never been beside them. It had always been behind them. And for the first time, I stopped making excuses for it. I picked up my phone again and read every message one last time. This time, something caught my attention that I'd completely missed before. The timestamps. My mother had sent those messages at 11:40 a.m. The chat showed that my father had read them just 2 minutes later. He saw every word. He read my mother's message calling the military embarrassing. He saw her plans to hide me at the back of the reception. And he chose to say absolutely nothing. That silence hurt more than the messages themselves. For years, I'd convinced myself my father was simply a quiet man trapped in the middle. Someone who wanted peace but didn't know how to stand up for me. I finally realized I'd been wrong. He wasn't trapped. He was comfortable. Year after year, he'd watched me disappear without saying a word. Every time my mother dismissed my career. Every time my accomplishments were ignored. Every time I became invisible. He stayed silent. That silence became its own answer. Oddly enough, it hurt even more than my mother's words. At least her behavior came from fear. She was running from painful memories she'd never escaped. My father wasn't running from anything. He simply chose comfort over his daughter. Again, and again, and again, I slowly stood up. Without saying a word, I slipped the blue dress off. I carefully folded it and placed it back over the chair where my mother had left it. I smoothed the fabric with my hand, almost gently. Not because I wanted it anymore, but because I was saying goodbye to the version of myself that had spent years trying to please everyone else. For the first time in my life, I wasn't angry. I was finished hiding. The only decision left was how I would walk into that ballroom. Later that afternoon, I arrived at the reception venue before most of the guests. I needed fresh air, and I needed something to keep my mind busy. The reception was being held inside a historic ballroom the Whitfield family had used for generations. As the staff finished arranging tables and decorations, I quietly walked through the room. Old habits die hard. Before any important event, I always liked to study my surroundings. As I wandered through the ballroom, I started noticing details I hadn't paid attention to before. Near the entrance, a polished brass plaque honored a memorial scholarship established in someone's name. Further down the hallway stood a glass display filled with old photographs. Several of them showed men wearing military uniforms. That surprised me. A few minutes later, Sloane found me. She looked beautiful even in her rehearsal clothes, though the stress of the wedding was beginning to show. We walked slowly together through the hall while she pointed out little family details. Without breaking stride, she smiled toward one of the old photographs. "That's my grandfather," she said warmly. "He served in the Marines. Honestly, he's the reason our family is the way it is." She spoke with obvious pride, as though honoring military service had always been part of her family's identity. Before I could ask another question, someone called her away to solve another wedding problem. I remained standing in front of the photograph, looking at the young Marine, looking at the family name beneath it. "He's the reason our family is the way it is." The words lingered in my mind. Something about them felt important. Something I couldn't quite place. But I had too much on my mind to chase the feeling, so I pushed it aside. Looking back, I realize I kept doing that throughout the entire weekend. I kept walking right past the most important clues. At the time, I believed the hardest part of the weekend would be facing my own family. I had no idea the Whitfields had spent generations honoring the very thing my family wanted hidden. That evening, alone in my room, I finally made my decision. I carefully laid my Marine dress blues across the bed. Every piece sat perfectly straight. Every button, every ribbon, every medal. I inspected each one with the same care I'd used countless times before. This wasn't about revenge. Never was. I wasn't planning to embarrass anyone. I wasn't going to interrupt the wedding. I wasn't preparing a speech. I wasn't going to mention the family group chat. I wasn't looking for a confrontation. I was simply done helping everyone pretend I didn't exist. There is a difference, and that difference mattered. For nearly 10 years, my family had asked me to become smaller so everyone else could feel comfortable. This time, I was simply going to arrive as myself. Nothing more, nothing less. I began pinning my medals onto the uniform one by one, which carried memories, places, people. When I reached one particular medal, my hands stopped moving. For the first time in years. They weren't steady. I tried fastening it once. Tried again. Finally it settled into place. I stared at the finished uniform for a long time. Then I want to tell you something directly. 'Cause I think some of you understand exactly what I was feeling. I almost chose the blue dress. I almost disappeared again. Not because I believed my mother was right, but because disappearing always seemed to hurt fewer people. I've always been the kind of person who counts everyone else's pain before my own. If you've ever been asked to hide the strongest part of yourself just to keep peace inside your own family, then you already know how heavy that blue dress felt in my hands. Stay with me, because what happened after I finally stopped hiding changed everything. The morning of the wedding, I arrived early with my garment bag resting over my shoulder. Before stepping inside, I made one decision that, looking back, says everything about the kind of person I wanted to be. I didn't wear my dress blues to the ceremony. Instead, I changed into simple civilian clothes and quietly slipped into a pew near the back of the church. The ceremony belonged to Wes and Sloane, not to me. No matter what had happened between my family and me, I refused to let my presence distract from their vows. That was the line I wouldn't cross. Whatever pain I carried, my brother still deserved a peaceful wedding day. So I stayed in the background and watched him marry the woman he loved. And something unexpected happened. Cried. Not out of sadness, but with genuine happiness. Wes looked equal parts terrified and overjoyed, while Sloane looked at him as though she'd finally found the answer she'd been searching for. For those few minutes, everything else faded away. Despite everything that had happened, I still loved my little brother. Family has a strange way of working. You can know exactly how often someone failed to stand beside you, and still love them with your whole heart. I allowed myself that moment. Then the ceremony ended. Guests slowly made their way across the beautifully kept lawn toward the reception ballroom. The doors opened wide. The string quartet began to play. Conversations blended with the soft clinking of glasses as nearly 150 guests filled the room. The Whitfields were greeting friends and relatives. My mother had already begun making her way from group to group, wearing the perfect smile she'd practiced for years. I stayed outside a little longer, waiting, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted the reception to settle before I changed. When the room had grown warm with conversation and everyone was focused on celebrating, I quietly stepped into the small side room where I'd left my garment bag, closed the door behind me, slowly unzipped the bag, and lifted out my marine dress blues. Every movement felt deliberate. I buttoned the coat, straightened the collar, adjusted every ribbon, checked each medal one final time. Then I reached for the door. Before my hand touched the handle, the door swung open. My mother stood there. The moment she saw the uniform, every bit of color drained from her face. First she went pale. Then her cheeks flushed red. Finally, pure panic settled across her expression. "What are you doing?" she whispered urgently, pulling the door shut behind her before anyone outside could hear. "Tori, we already talked about this," I answered as calmly as I could. "I thought about everything you said, and I've made my decision. I'm wearing my uniform to Wes's wedding. I promise I won't make a scene. You can trust me." She didn't seem to hear a single word. Instead, she stepped closer until only a few inches separated us. Her voice dropped into that familiar whisper I'd heard so many times growing up. The same sharp tone that used to drift through the heating vents into my bedroom. "The military is embarrassing." This time there was no attempt to soften it. No careful wording. No polite explanation. Just the truth she'd believed for years. Wear the blue dress. For once in your life. Blend in. She looked toward the ballroom doors before lowering her voice even further. "These people aren't like us. You are not turning Wes's wedding into some military parade." I noticed her hands shaking. For the first time, I didn't just see my mother. I saw the frightened 11-year-old girl she'd once been. The child standing in front of her classmates while a teacher held up her worn-out shoes for everyone to see. I understood exactly where her fear came from. I even felt compassion for it. But understanding someone doesn't mean surrendering to them. So I gently shook my head. "No." Her eyes filled with tears. "Please. Don't embarrass us." The words sounded like both a desperate request and a warning. She truly believed disaster was about to happen. I looked at her for a long moment, then quietly answered with the only sentence I had left. "Mom. I'm not the embarrassing one." Without another word, I reached past her, opened the door, and stepped into the music before either of us could take those words back. Now picture the ballroom for a moment. It was enormous. Tall windows stretched almost to the ceiling, allowing warm afternoon sunlight to pour across polished wooden floors. The dance floor occupied the center of the room. The head table stood at the far end. Guests gathered in small circles, drinks in hand, chatting while they waited for dinner to begin. I entered through a side door near the back. That meant I didn't need to cross the room. My assigned seat, Table 9, was already close by, exactly where my mother had arranged for me to be. Hidden, out of sight, if I wanted. Even wearing my uniform, I could still disappear by quietly following the wall. For a brief moment, old habits almost won. I started walking exactly that way, keeping close to the edge, heading toward the place my family had chosen for me. I want to be absolutely clear. I wasn't trying to attract attention. I'd promised Wes and myself that I wouldn't create a scene. I intended to sit quietly at table 9, remain completely myself, and let that be enough. I had no speech prepared, no dramatic entrance planned, no secret desire for revenge, just a Marine uniform, a seat near the back, and Danny Brennan's challenge coin resting safely inside my pocket. I had taken only a handful of steps. Perhaps 10 at most. When I felt something change. Anyone who's spent enough time around large groups recognizes that feeling. The atmosphere shifts. The conversations soften. The energy in the room subtly changes direction. At first, I didn't know why. I kept walking without looking up. Then, across the ballroom, near the head table, an elderly man with silver hair and perfect posture slowly placed his glass on the table and rose to his feet. Before I tell you what happened next, there's one detail I skipped, and it's important. Just minutes earlier, while I stood alone in that dressing room before my mother interrupted me, I'd looked at myself in the mirror one last time. Piece by piece,